Democrats have a clear blueprint to a 2028 comeback, and it was written by Donald Trump. Ever since last year, there's been a ton of debate about Democrats' autopsy, a report about how it lost the 2024 election and what it would need to do to win again. This was modeled off a report Republicans released after their 2012 loss, and initially, it was a big focus for Democrats after Kamala Harris lost. The incoming DNC chair, Ken Martin, explicitly promised to release it. And then, late in 2025, he totally reversed. And now it's not clear if we're going to get it at all. Now, some people are talking about leaking it, some people who were interviewed for it are telling people what they said about it, people are debating if it was scrapped because it said something about Gaza or Biden's age, whatever. And this does matter. I think it's probably true that this got scrapped because the results did not make the Democratic establishment look good. But Democrats should be really careful about caring too much about this report, especially because Donald Trump already gave them a model for how to mount a comeback. Let's rewind to 2013. Republicans had just lost to Obama again, which was a huge disappointment. If you're not a conservative, or you didn't grow up conservative, or you haven't hung out with conservatives, it's hard to fully understand how big of a deal this was. For many people on the right, this was equivalent to what Trump winning in 2024 felt like for the left. A total cataclysm, something that showed the country had fundamentally changed for the worse.
America right now deserves Barack Obama.
And after that, there was a ton of conversation about whether the Republican Party should moderate, or more accurately, how much the Republican Party should moderate. And eventually, the verdict came down. The GOP's economic policies, free trade, cuts to the social safety net, big tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, those were fine. Nothing to change there. What Republicans did need to do was just become more moderate on immigration. I'm really not exaggerating here. The RNC released an official report in 2013 called the Growth and Opportunity Project. Oh, it stands for GOP. That explicitly said this, that the only real policy change the party needed to have was, quote, embracing and championing comprehensive immigration reform. By contrast, it explicitly praised Republicans who supported, quote, well thought out entitlement reforms, which means cuts and changes to programs like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. What wasn't mentioned even once was the Iraq War, which did more than anything to ruin George Bush's presidency and elect Obama. And when it came to social issues, like gay marriage, which hit majority support in 2012, and abortion, which most Americans consistently supported remaining legal, the party's recommendation was to change their, quote, tone, not their stance. And in 2013, 2014, and early 2015, this looked like the undisputed new baseline for Republicans. The GOP would be led by people like Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush, the same old alliance between supply-side economics and religious conservatives, but now with a pro-immigration vibe and a new coat of paint on top. The only problem was, that was never what the electorate wanted. And the person who proved that was Donald Trump. Trump rode down that escalator and did the complete opposite of everything that autopsy told Republicans to do. In the past year or so, some smart people have actually talked about this dynamic a bit, and it's worth checking out and reading that work. But not to toot our own horn here, I actually talked about this a month after the 2024 election. Go check it out if you want. But here's a quick recap. Instead of sticking with the traditional Republican economic positions, Trump ripped them up. He called for protecting the social safety net and even for raising taxes on rich people. He even at one point ran on universal healthcare and raising the minimum wage. And on those calls to moderate on immigration, he did the exact opposite, doubling down on a hawkish immigration stance. And he aggressively went after the Republican establishment on foreign policy, explicitly saying the Iraq War
was a big, fat mistake.
And he didn't just follow the advice to change his tone on social issues, he actually changed some of the substance here, doing things like openly saying trans people should be able to use the bathrooms that match their identities.
So if Caitlyn Jenner were to walk into Trump Tower and want to use the bathroom, you would be fine with her using any bathroom she chooses?
That is correct.
And it's really worth emphasizing. This was the exact opposite of what the smart people on both sides thought Republicans needed to do. So it was a big surprise to a lot of people when Trump's messaging totally worked with a lot of voters, especially working class voters. And the reason it worked was because actual real life Americans are way different from the elites who run DC or work in the news industry. Take this study of the 2016 electorate, which segmented voters into 4 categories based off of economic and cultural issues. That quadrant at the bottom right is economically conservative and culturally liberal. People who are pro-choice, pro-gay, pro-immigration, but also support tax cuts and cuts to the social safety net. AKA, a lot of what the 2013 RNC wanted Republicans to be. And you'll notice there's barely anyone in it, because basically the only people who fall in this category live in Washington, D.C. or Manhattan. A much, much bigger portion falls into the opposite category, the culturally conservative, economically liberal quadrant. The people uncomfortable with some liberal cultural stances or more immigration, but want the rich to be taxed and want safety net programs to be protected. And the existence of these people was completely ignored by our political and media establishments. Shows like 30 Rock, which, full disclosure, I've rewatched too many times, used to even make fun of the idea that people like this could even exist.
What are your politics?
Social conservative, fiscal liberal.
But they do exist, and they were crucial to Trump ever winning to begin with. It breaks a lot of liberals' brains to hear this, but polls in 2016 repeatedly showed that the electorate found Donald Trump to be less extreme than Hillary Clinton. And that is the core of what Democrats can learn here. Trump disentangled issues that people previously thought or wanted to all move on one spectrum together. He decided to move right on some issues while moving left on others. And by doing so, he rejected the binary that many people thought you had to choose between, grabbing the most popular parts of both sides of the Republican Party. He ran against the establishment, and he planted his flag where most undecided voters in the country actually are: economically populist and culturally moderate. By the way, this whole issue is going to be a common theme in a lot of the stuff I make before the midterms, so make sure to subscribe to the channel and my newsletter. And while things have changed a little, thanks to Trump trying to overreach on as much as possible, a lot of the fundamentals haven't. In Trump's second term, Democrats have a lot of the same vulnerabilities that Republicans had in Obama's second term. Studies show that on many cultural issues, progressive Democrats are now way to the left of average Americans, including non-white voters. Polls show that 2/3 of Americans agree with Republicans' stance on a lot of hot-button issues around trans rights. Polls show that majorities, including majorities of some non-white voters, oppose affirmative action. And even as polls show more and more Americans dislike how Trump is handling immigration, they consistently show at least half agree with his stated goals around immigration, and 80% support some deportations. At the same time, Democrats' stances on economic issues are mostly really popular. 2/3 support a $15 minimum wage. 70% say there's too much money in politics. 3/4 say the government should directly cap the price of prescription drugs. 80% say they agree with the idea that the wealthy and corporations do not pay their fair share in taxes. And as many as 85% of Americans oppose cuts to programs like Social Security. Those are fundamentally different universes on issues we often treat as inherently linked. In fact, these polls show us that there are, in fact, tens of millions of Americans who support mass deportations and support prescription drug caps, who oppose transgender women competing in women's sports, and believe in raising taxes on the wealthy, who want to protect the social safety net from being cut, and oppose affirmative action. Basically, people are complicated. And you can think any number of those views are right or wrong or partially right or whatever. That's your right. But it's just basic reality that you probably can't name a single national politician who holds any of those combinations of views. And while Democrats may well perform super well this year no matter what, winning in a presidential cycle is much different. Republicans learned this lesson in the 2010 midterms, when they won big and thought they had cracked the code for a comeback. They hadn't. And they lost when more of the country tuned in 2012. Without deeper introspection and correction, they run the risk of making the same mistake Republicans did. And that's both the opening and the challenge here for Democrats. Many of the people in the party who are most gung-ho about their most popular economic positions, like, say, AOC, have also taken really unpopular stances on issues like abolishing ICE or defunding the police. Many of the people who are closer to where the electorate is on cultural issues like immigration, like, say, Pete Buttigieg or Josh Shapiro, either oppose those popular economic stances, refuse to run against the Democratic Party establishment, or are just not good at conjuring that anti-establishment populist vibe. The opening here is for a candidate who can do what Trump did: take the most popular parts from each camp, match their platform to the electorate, and win. In 2028, that might look like someone who runs against the Biden administration's unpopular foreign policy record, who leans heavily into issues like corruption and populist economics, who takes a more moderate stance on issues like immigration. Funnily, there is one person who might match that, who voted to cut off arms sales to Israel, who voted for some tough on immigration stuff, and who's made corruption their centerpiece issue. And while it's still really early, he's someone who a lot of people, from analysts to prediction markets, are starting to talk about as a dark horse candidate. Now, it's worth doing a couple disclaimers here. First, one really important thing in all of this is that Trump's actual presidencies ended up being way, way different from his promises. Love him, hate him, whatever, it's just a basic fact that as president, he ended up being a mostly standard Republican on most economic issues. Raising the minimum wage, raising taxes on the rich, a big infrastructure bill, None of that ended up happening. His two signature pieces of legislation, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in his first term and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in his second term, were basically a return to Bush-Romney Republicanism. Big tax cuts for the wealthy, big cuts to the social safety net. In fact, a lot of Republicans, like former Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal, who was basically the platonic ideal for the 2013 Republican autopsy, explicitly praised him for this. Now, that doesn't change the success of his campaigns, but it's an important thing to make clear. And second, it's worth saying that cultural issues are really what we make of them. One way to think about this is to look at how cultural attitudes have changed just in the 21st century. Since 2001, Gallup has found that the country has continuously gotten more liberal on basically everything, from sex outside of marriage, to having a baby outside of marriage, to the morality of being gay, to marijuana legalization, to the death penalty. The median voter's views now would have been considered very culturally liberal then. And there's also a ton of nuance when you dig just a little bit deeper. Trans rights, like we mentioned before, are a good example. Americans pretty consistently do not like trans women and girls in women's sports. But polls also show supermajorities support anti-discrimination protections in housing and employment. The point here is that nuance matters. There's a difference between being culturally conservative, which some Americans are, and culturally moderate or mixed, which most Americans are. And these caveats are about more than trying to preempt someone yelling at me in the comments. Feel free to yell at me in the comments. It's a really important part of this. To some people, on the left and the right, this might sound like getting more conservative. It's not. It's just about meeting people where they are, on economics and on culture. Trump learned that lesson, and he won bigly. Let me know what you think about all of this below, and remember to subscribe to the channel and my newsletter.